Hello and welcome to Devil's Advocate. How should we view the Copenhagen Accord, as a failure or as a success? That's the key issue I shall explore today with the Prime Minister's Special Envoy on Climate Change, Shyam Saran. Mr. Saran, let me start with a simple question. Do you view Copenhagen as a small step forward, as a disappointment, or something in between?
Well, I would say something in between, yes. I don't think it's been a failure because there are two aspects to the outcome of Copenhagen. One is the so-called Copenhagen Accord, which with the exception of about 4 or 5 countries was endorsed by virtually the entire plenary which was assembled in Copenhagen.
Taken note of, not really endorsed.
No, it was not endorsed. It was taken note of. But the more important decision from my point of view is that a unanimous decision was taken that we would continue with the negotiations on the 2 tracks, as it were. One is the Bali Action Plan track and the other is the Kyoto Protocol track. That means the negotiations which were supposed to end with a Copenhagen outcome and could not succeed, those negotiations will now be continued with the same mandate as before.
And yet you describe this only as something in between, not, I noticed significantly, as a small step forward.
Well, I would say it is beyond a step forward because here you had a accord which touched upon all the major issues, outstanding issues before the negotiations, and in a sense represented a very broad consensus of the international community. As I said, there were a few countries which did not endorse this particular
190
document.
almost, according to Reuters, had major differences one way or another. That's not a few.
When the time came to take note of the outcome document, that is the Copenhagen Accord, the only countries which stood aside were 4 or 5 countries, mainly from the Latin
They
American
refused to
region.
simply take note even, but the others wouldn't go beyond taking note. They wouldn't endorse.
It was not, it could not go beyond taking note precisely because of the position taken by these 4 or 5 countries. Because you know the UN works by
Unanimously.
consensus. Therefore, it could not be endorsed if even one country had problems with
Let's
that.
come to the criticisms of Copenhagen that have been voiced in India and in particular in the Indian Parliament. To begin with, it's said that the Copenhagen Accord has created an alternative alignment which identifies a different and lower set of obligations to those established by the Kyoto Protocol, and this will, in due course, inevitably lead to the abandonment of Kyoto. Can you deny that?
No, I would like to clarify this by pointing out to what I said earlier. On the one hand, you have this Copenhagen Accord, which was taken note of. If this was the only thing which emerged from Copenhagen, then what you are saying is right. But what has actually emerged from Copenhagen is also a decision which I believe is a much more important decision, because it is not just taken note of, it is a decision that we must continue negotiations on all the outstanding issues post-Copenhagen.
I don't deny it. There are 2 tracks that have been established. No one can deny that. But when one track is less onerous than the other, and therefore more inviting and beguiling, particularly to the developed countries, inevitably their pressure will be to take the lesser track. And when that happens, the more onerous one, which is Kyoto, will over a period of time be forgotten and buried.
I don't think that the Kyoto Protocol can be forgotten or buried for the simple reason that it is a valid legal instrument. If there are those who wish to leave the Kyoto Protocol, they can denounce the Kyoto Protocol and leave it.
If enough people leave the Kyoto Protocol, it's buried by effect on its own.
Well, let us come to that possibility, but
You
at the moment,
concede it is a
there
possibility.
can be a possibility, but at the moment, all countries, without exception, have agreed that the Kyoto Protocol track must remain and we should continue our negotiations on that.
Let me quote to you your own colleague, Rajni Ranjan Rashmi, speaking to The Hindu on the 22nd of December. He's a joint director in the Ministry of Environment, and he says that the treaty has opened a window for a new legal treaty that may result in the burial of the Kyoto Protocol. Your own colleagues are fearing this.
That it opens a window and that possibility is there, of course, but that depends upon how we take the negotiations forward.
Okay.
What I'm trying to point out is that in a sense, we have agreed that we will live to fight another day, because we have both the tracks, which are very important to us, entirely in place for the post-Copenhagen
Let's say
period.
it's a 50-50 chance. A window's open. We don't know whether that window will lead to something. But what is perhaps undeniable is that the Copenhagen Accord has exempted the developed countries, A, from legally binding emission cuts, and B, many people believe, even from their original acceptance of historic responsibility. Those are 2 steps backwards.
No, I think that is a misunderstanding. What the Copenhagen Accord has done is to endorse the view that developed countries have a responsibility to engage in absolute emission reductions, while major developing countries have the responsibility of mitigating the rise in their emissions.
But your own language gives the game away. Have a responsibility to engage in emission-reducing cuts. But they are not identified and they're not legally binding at the moment. And there's no real reference to historic responsibility either. So you accept those 2 points.
Agreed. But, you know, we have also at the same time agreed to carry on with the negotiations on the basis of the Bali Action Plan. And Bali Action Plan first and foremost says that it reaffirms the principles and provisions.
In other words,
of the
once
UNFCCC.
again, you're living to fight another day. The battle is by no means won.
No,
it's not settled.
No, it is not settled. And I think it is a very important achievement of the developing countries that they did not allow this particular saga to end at Copenhagen.
But they didn't succeed either in enforcing legally binding cuts or in enforcing acceptance of historic responsibility.
There was no way that you can force people to do what they do not wish to
Absolutely.
do.
And the West got away with what it didn't want to do.
They have not got away with it for the simple reason that they have agreed that this is a matter which must be the subject of continuing negotiations post-Copenhagen.
Let's come to how this accord affects the developing countries. The developing countries have agreed to accept what is called international consultations and analysis. I put it to you that is just language that disguises the fact that they've actually agreed to a review. Reviews were something they didn't want. Now, under the disguise of consultations and analysis, that's exactly what they've agreed to.
No. I think, again, there is a misunderstanding. You are looking at only a few phrases without looking at the totality of the sentence. What we have agreed to is consultation and analysis, but it also says according to agreed guidelines. And it says that these agreed guidelines must not in any way violate national sovereignty.
Let's take that sentence apart bit by bit. Let's first begin by asking what is the difference between analysis and review. The Oxford English Dictionary defines review as a general survey or assessment of a subject. It defines analysis as a detailed examination of elements or structure of something. Clearly, analysis is more rigorous, onerous, and more intrusive than review. You've accepted something that's much harder and tougher than review.
Again, I think we are quibbling with words here.
But words are important.
The review and verification, these were the 2 words which were actually asked for by the Americans and the Western countries.
And you've granted the review.
And what we have said...
You've granted the review in the disguise of an analysis.
No, we have not granted review, because what we are saying is that we will consult in terms of whatever we have put forward as information on our actions. If there are any doubts which are raised about, for example, the statistics which we give,
Mr. Saran,
any kind of data that we give, that is something that we are willing to clarify.
Mr. Saran, can you analyze without reviewing? Clearly you can't. Therefore, in the process of analysis, a review is inherent. It will take place even if you don't want to describe it as one.
What we were worried about was the kind of review which would look at the adequacy of our mitigation efforts. We have no difficulty in terms of transparency of our efforts.
No, what you also...
So whatever we are giving, for example, to the Parliament as information on whatever targets we have undertaken, whether we have achieved those targets or not, what is the basis on which such action has been taken? If we have produced statistics, what are the assumptions behind those tests?
I'm afraid it's much worse than that, and I'll tell you why. You've agreed also to consultations. The minister speaking in Parliament justified the use of the word consultations by reference to the consultations that the IMF has with its members. But you know, perhaps much better than the minister, that Article 4 consultations of the IMF happen under the surveillance mandate of the fund. That's deeply intrusive. By comparing one to the other, the ministers actually, without realizing it, given the game away.
I think, there is no replication of what happens under the IMF in this particular case.
He's compared it. In trying to justify it, he's compared it.
There is a certain similarity in terms of what we agree to do here with the kind of consultations we have under the IMF or the WTO. This is what he has said.
Can I interrupt you once again? The minister, in fact, went one step further. He tried to criticize and rebuke the position taken by David Axelrod, the American president's advisor, that now countries like India could be challenged. You've agreed to consultations. That creates a process where precisely your findings and presentations will be challenged. It's not just inevitable, it's inescapable. So challenge is built in.
No. Merely because Axelrod has said something doesn't mean that that is the correct interpretation of the language.
But at a consultation, people have a right to challenge you.
Please, as I mentioned to you, whatever be the consultation and analysis which is to be carried out, they have to be subject to agreed guidelines. Which means what?
Which are not agreed as yet. And therefore, in even reaching that agreement, you'll have trouble.
We have to negotiate on what would be the agreed guidelines for such analysis and such consultation.
And do you know what your own colleague Pradipto Ghosh, a former secretary in the Ministry of Environment and one of your lead negotiators at Copenhagen, has said about operationalizing international consultations and analysis? He says it will be extremely difficult and contentious for the very reason that I'm pointing out, that the Americans will insist this is room for review and challenge.
I cannot interpret what this particular colleague or that particular colleague is saying. I can only give you my interpretation of what the language is. When I was present at the time when these phrases were agreed upon, it was very clear to us what we meant when we agreed to
but
this.
But what about what the Americans meant? Is that equally clear?
I'm not concerned about what the Americans mean, because I have to go by what we meant.
But if your own colleague differs with you?
Well, if my colleague differs with me, let the colleague differ with me.
But then doesn't it suggest that there's confusion?
No. As far as I'm concerned, there is no confusion whatsoever, because what we were not willing to accept was any kind of verification. We were not willing to accept any kind of review in the sense that somebody will come to us and say, look, I'm going to scrutinize your strategies for development, your climate change action plans, and tell you whether this is adequate or not.
I hear what you're saying. The audience hears what you're saying. But isn't your answer almost proving the point that Arun Jaitley made in the Rajya Sabha, that the government has been outwitted in the drafting of this agreement? There are so many interpretations in your own team as well.
I think that is a very unfair statement to make. We were present at the time when 4 heads of state representing developing countries had sat together with Obama. The debate which took place makes it very clear what the 4 heads of state and government had in mind when they agreed to this language. It was very clear that we would not accept any kind of intrusive scrutiny into our policies. What we were prepared to do was to be entirely transparent with whatever we were taking action on domestic.
Isn't this precisely what Arun Jaitley meant when he said that once again we see the Sharm el-Sheikh syndrome? What the accord says, what the piece of paper that you've agreed to says is different to your interpretation, and as a result there's confusion, and now you're trying to justify one by changing positions.
I'm not justifying anything. I'm only giving you my understanding of what happened at the meeting where this phraseology was agreed upon.
All right.
And again, I would stress that whatever be the basis on which such consultation and analysis is carried out is also subject to agreed guidelines.
Which aren't agreed as yet.
That means unless we sit down together and negotiate what is the basis on which this analysis is going to be carried out, this consultation is carried out, there will be no consultation and analysis.
In which case, we'll have achieved nothing. Let's take a break at that point and let's come back and turn to the geopolitical implications of Copenhagen. They are perhaps equally important, but they haven't as yet been fully understood. That's in a moment's time. See you after the break. Welcome back to Devil's Advocate and an interview with the Prime Minister's Special Envoy on Climate Change, Shyam Saran. Mr. Saran, let's come to the major geopolitical implications of the Copenhagen Accord. To begin with, there was the close cooperation and alliance between the four so-called basic countries. Is this a new grouping of force in international relations, or is it just a passing phenomenon?
Let me give you some background. During the last 2 years of the negotiations which have been taking place on climate change, these four countries have worked very closely together, coordinated their positions, and in a sense have also shaped the positions taken by the G77 and China. So this grouping in a sense was always there in these negotiations. What happened at Copenhagen was that the cooperation and the coordination within this group was elevated to the summit level, where the four heads of state and government both in the morning met together on the 18th to strategize their positions for the rest of the day, and again, as you are aware, they met in the evening again to review what had happened during the day and to see what is the way in which the four countries could carry this process forward.
But is this a group that will now continue to coordinate and cooperate on other issues as well, or is this just limited to climate change and Copenhagen?
Well, it is a start. Because, as I mentioned to you, the basic countries have not collaborated together in this manner, in such an effective manner, in other fora.
So this is a possibility that could continue in other realms as well?
It could, depending upon whether or not on other issues also, as on this issue, there is a certain convergence of interest.
So this is a potential new force in international relations?
Yes, it could be.
The second thing that emerged at Copenhagen was the close understanding and cooperation, some would say, in fact, the close united work between India and China. Given the serious strains in the relationship that was so apparent just 3-4 months ago, do we now see a new and better understanding between Delhi and Beijing?
I would say that certainly the atmosphere of the bilateral relationship between the two countries has certainly taken a positive turn as a result of the very close and coordinated manner in which we work together in Copenhagen.
So could the working together in Copenhagen feed back into the bilateral relationship and help ease some of the strains?
I would certainly hope it could. I think I would want to convey to you something which Prime Minister mentioned to Prime Minister Wan Xiaopao when he met him bilaterally. And he said that in April 2005, when the two leaders had met, they had agreed to establish a strategic and cooperative partnership between the two countries. Why? Because they recognize that there was a certain strategic dimension to their bilateral relationship. And what was important was that that particular strategic dimension should also inform the process of strengthening and taking forward our bilateral relationship.
And that strategic partnership, that strategic dimension has gone one step further at Copenhagen.
I have no doubt that it has.